Hello, listeners. Welcome to today's story.
My 9-year-old daughter played 5 videos in a Boston courtroom last October. The last one was a plan to burn me alive in my own kitchen on my 22nd wedding anniversary. Her name is Sophia Antonia Morelli. She was clutching a small navy apron I had sewn for her when she was 4 years old, with a single Italian word stitched in white thread across the chest: Bambina, little one. When she stood up at 25 minutes past 9 on a Tuesday morning in October, the bailiff looked confused. Judge Eleanor Sullivan looked surprised. My wife of 22 years went completely still, and my best friend of 35 years, who happened to be sitting beside me as my divorce lawyer, started doing something I had never seen him do in 3.5 decades. He started sweating. I am Frank Morelli. I am 58 years old. I have spent my whole life running my family's Italian restaurant on Hanover Street in Boston's North End. The same restaurant my grandfather Antonio opened in 1961 with $7 in his pocket and a recipe for tomato sauce folded inside a leather wallet. What I did not know, until that Tuesday morning, was that my brother Marco's funeral was the day my best friend and my wife had decided to take everything from me. My daughter recorded them in secret for 8 months, behind a toaster, under a dining room table, on a spice shelf in my own kitchen. This is the story of how my 9-year-old daughter saved my life, and how my mother had been waiting 22 years to help her. My 9-year-old daughter stood up in a Boston courtroom and asked the judge if she could play a video. Her name is Sophia Antonia Morelli, and she was clutching a small kitchen apron I had sewn for her when she was 4 years old. The apron was navy blue, with a single Italian word stitched in white thread across the chest: Bambina, little one. The bailiff looked confused. Judge Eleanor Sullivan looked surprised. My wife of 22 years went completely still, and my best friend of 35 years, who happened to be sitting beside me as my divorce lawyer, started doing something I had never seen him do in 3.5 decades. He started sweating. I am Frank Morelli. I am 58 years old. I have spent 45 of those years working in my family's restaurant on Hanover Street in Boston's North End. My grandfather Antonio opened the doors in 1961 with $7 in his pocket and a handwritten recipe for tomato sauce that he kept folded inside a worn leather wallet until the day he died. 65 years later, that recipe still simmers in our kitchen every evening, and until that Tuesday morning in October, I believed I had spent my entire life protecting it. My hands still smelled faintly of garlic, the way they always did. 22 years of marriage, and Theresa had still complained about the smell that very morning. Looking back now, I understand the truth was much simpler and much crueler. I should have seen it at my brother Marco's funeral. The way Stephen held Theresa's elbow when she fainted from grief. Too long, too tender. The way she allowed her cheek to rest against his shoulder for just a moment more than a friend's. I was burying my only brother that afternoon at Holy Cross Cemetery in Malden, and I was too broken to notice that another part of my life was being buried beside him. I noticed everything later, after my daughter stood up, but I am getting ahead of myself. That morning, the courthouse on Pemberton Square smelled like every courthouse smells. Old wood polished too many times. Industrial disinfectant. The particular dust that settles in buildings where people come to lose things they cannot get back. The wooden bench beneath me was hard against my lower spine, which had been failing me since the doctor diagnosed my degenerative discs 6 years earlier. I had taken 3 Advil before leaving the house. They had not helped. Somewhere down the hallway, a court clerk was typing slowly, the keystrokes echoing against the marble like a slow heartbeat. I sat in courtroom 408 on the 3rd floor. To my left, sat my lawyer, Stephen Caldwell. To my right, an empty space where my daughter Sophia would soon return after the brief recess. Across the aisle sat my wife Theresa, in a charcoal gray suit she had bought specifically for this hearing. I knew this because the credit card statement had arrived 2 weeks ago, and I had quietly paid the $800 without mentioning it. I always quietly paid. I thought that was love. Theresa sat with her ankles crossed and her hands folded, the way she had practiced in front of the bathroom mirror that morning. I had seen her practicing. I had told myself she was nervous. I had told myself a lot of things in those final months. Stephen leaned toward me. His cologne smelled like sandalwood and something newer, something I did not recognize. He had been my best man at this same woman's wedding, 22 years ago, in this same city. He had stood at the altar of St. Leonard's Church and held my wedding ring in a steady hand. He had been the godfather at my daughter's baptism, holding her tiny body over the font while the priest poured water on her forehead. He had carried Marco's coffin alongside me when my brother died of pancreatic cancer in 2017. He patted my hand the way he always did, the way a brother does. "Trust me, Frank," he said quietly. "The case is hopeless. Sign the settlement. Take what they offer. Walk away with your dignity. We can talk after." I nodded. I had been nodding to Stephen Caldwell for 35 years. Then I turned my head to the gallery, where my mother Lucia sat in a black mourning scarf she had worn since my brother's death. She was 78 years old. She did not understand English well. I always assumed. She was watching Stephen now, and her eyes were not the eyes of a confused old woman. They were the eyes of someone who had been waiting a very long time for something. And beside her sat my daughter Sophia. She was 9. She was holding her small apron in her lap, and she was looking at Stephen Caldwell with an expression I had never seen on a child's face before. It was not curiosity. It was not affection. It was something closer to what a hunter looks like, the moment before the trap is sprung. I had seen that expression once before, when she was 4 years old and had found a snake in our garden. She had not been afraid then either. I felt a cold wash of unease down my spine. I dismissed it. I had no idea that in less than 90 minutes, my 9-year-old daughter would stand up, raise her small hand, and ask Judge Sullivan to play a video that would not only end my marriage and destroy my best friendship. It would also expose a plan to burn down the restaurant my grandfather built, and to put me inside it when the fire started. But for that single, peaceful moment at 22 minutes past 9 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, I leaned back against the hard wooden bench, patted Stephen's hand the way a brother does, and prepared to lose what I thought was the worst thing a man could lose. I had no idea I was about to be saved. The woman who had been hired to destroy my reputation stood up at 25 minutes past 9 and opened a folder so thick it could have been a novel. Her name was Patricia Cole. She wore a navy suit cut sharp enough to cause injury, and her hair was the color and texture of a steel wool pad. She had practiced law in Boston for over 30 years, and her firm had a slogan on their website that read, "We don't lose." I had never met her before that morning. I would learn, in the next 45 minutes, that she had been preparing my divorce for over 2 years. "Your Honor," she began, in a voice trained for juries, "this is a case of profound emotional neglect." She walked the length of her table the way actors walk a stage, each step measured, each pause earned. She listed me to Judge Sullivan as if reading a charge sheet. "The respondent, Mr. Morelli, has worked between 60 and 70 hours per week for the entirety of his marriage. He has been absent from his daughter's life for 38 specific occasions, which we have documented, including her kindergarten graduation, 2 emergency room visits, and her piano recital this past September. He has carried his family's restaurant debt of $420,000 on his shoulders alone, while refusing to allow his wife any meaningful input into financial decisions. He is, in every observable sense, an absent husband and an emotionally unavailable father. I felt my mouth open. I wanted to say that the piano recital had been rescheduled and that I had flown back from Providence to make it. And Sophia had hugged me afterward and told me I was the only father who had brought roses. But I closed my mouth. Stephen put his hand on my forearm. "Not yet, Frank," he whispered. "Let her finish." Patricia Cole was not finished. She had only just begun. "Therefore," she said, "our client, Theresa Morelli, seeks the following remedies: primary physical custody of the minor child, Sophia Antonia Morelli, sale of the marital home in Quincy, with proceeds divided equally, and sale of the marital business, Morelli's Trattoria on Hanover Street, with the proceeds divided equally. Due to the impracticality of one spouse continuing to operate a business that has caused such profound damage to the marriage." The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the wooden table with both hands. She wanted to sell the restaurant. She wanted to sell the place where my grandfather had taught me to peel garlic when I was 4 years old. The place where my father had collapsed against the prep counter and died of a stroke at 63. The place where I had carved my brother Marco's name into the basement beam the week we buried him. She wanted to sell the only thing my family had built in 3 generations. She wanted to sell what could not be sold. Stephen leaned close, and his cologne pressed against my ear. "It is hopeless, Frank," he murmured. "Sign the settlement they offered last week. Take half. Walk away with your dignity." I nodded again, because nodding was what my body had been trained to do beside Stephen Caldwell for 35 years. But for the first time in those 3.5 decades, my mind drifted away from him entirely. It drifted to a morning in October of 2015, St. Leonard's Church on Prince Street, the oldest Italian Catholic church in the North End. The same stone walls where my grandfather had been married, where my parents had been married, where Theresa and I had been married, and where, just 1 month after she was born, my daughter Sophia was baptized. Stephen had stood at the marble baptismal font in a charcoal suit, holding my 1-month-old daughter as if she were made of spun glass. The priest had asked the godfather to repeat the sacred vow, and Stephen had spoken in a clear, steady voice that filled the stone nave. "I solemnly swear before God and this congregation to protect this child as if she were my own. I will be her shield. I will be her witness. I will love her father as my brother for the rest of my days." The congregation had applauded. For 2 full minutes, I had cried, the way Italian fathers do, silently and with my chin tilted upward to hide it. Theresa had squeezed Stephen's arm. The priest had smiled at us all the way priests smile when they believe they have witnessed something holy. Only one person in the front pew had not applauded. My mother Lucia. She had sat with her hands folded in her lap, her black widow's scarf tied tight beneath her chin, her eyes fixed on Stephen Caldwell with an expression I had not understood at the time. I had assumed she was lost in prayer. I had assumed she was thinking of my father, who had died 6 months earlier. I had assumed many things that day. I would learn, in time, that my mother had assumed nothing. I returned my eyes to the present courtroom. Patricia Cole was still speaking, but her voice had become a distant rumble. Stephen sat beside me, his hand still on my forearm, his cologne still in my nostrils, his face arranged in the careful composition of a brother, trying to spare another brother from pain. If I had known, in that moment, what my daughter was about to play on her tablet, I would have grabbed her hand and run out of that courthouse and never come back. But I did not know, and so I sat, and so I listened. And so Stephen Caldwell, my best friend of 35 years, the man who had sworn before God to protect my child, continued patting my hand the way a brother does. Recess was called at 20 minutes after 10. I rose from the wooden bench too quickly, and the pain in my lower back flared like an old enemy. I walked alone into the marble hallway and found a stone bench under a tall, arched window. The morning light through that glass had been polished smooth by 100 years of grieving spouses and bankrupt businessmen. I sat on the bench, and for the first time since I had walked into the courtroom, I let my mind drift backward instead of forward. I thought about the coffee. Every morning for 22 years, I had risen at 4:30 in the morning. I never used an alarm clock. My body had been a clock for so long that it kept time imperfectly, but always close enough to matter. I would slide out of bed without disturbing Theresa, who slept on her side of the mattress in a way that suggested an invisible wall ran down the center of the bed. I would walk barefoot down the hallway, past Sophia's door, past my father's old apron in the closet, past the framed photograph of my grandfather Antonio in the kitchen of Morelli's in 1963. I would arrive in our kitchen and turn on a single lamp. I would grind the espresso beans Lucia bought every Friday from a little Italian grocer on Endicott Street. I would tamp the grounds the way my father had taught me when I was 7 years old, applying exactly 30 pounds of pressure, no more, no less. I would brew 2 demi-tasse cups, one for me, one for Theresa, on a saucer with a small spoon, which I would carry up the stairs and place on her nightstand. I would kiss her hair if she was sleeping deeply enough not to feel it. Then I would return to the kitchen, tear a small sheet of paper from the yellow notepad we kept by the telephone, and write the same 6 words I had written for 22 years. Have a good day. Ricci, love, Frank. I would set the note beside the half cup of cream she preferred for her second cup. The cream she would drink at 7, after she dressed. Then I would leave for the restaurant. The drive from our house in Quincy to Hanover Street took 38 minutes at that hour, and I made it in silence, because I had been told for so many years that silence was a husband's gift. I never knew, until much later, that Theresa threw every single one of those notes into the trash. She did not save them in a drawer the way some wives saved old love letters. She did not press them into a memory book. She did not even read them carefully. Among the coffee grounds and orange peels in our trash bin were 7 small folded sheets of yellow paper each week, with my handwriting on them, 6 words at a time. For 1,144 weeks, thousands of small declarations of love, thrown out as if they were nothing. I sat on that marble bench in the courthouse hallway and looked down at my own hands. They were the hands of a man who had peeled garlic for 45 years. The skin was thickened along the heel of each palm. The right thumbnail had a small ridge from a freezer door I had slammed in the winter of 1996. The left forearm carried a scar from where a pot of marinara had splashed when I was 19 years old, just learning. These were not handsome hands, but they were honest ones. These hands had written "I love you" in 1,000 small ways. She had thrown every one of them into the trash. I began to notice the other things. They came back to me now in the silence of that hallway, the way small details come back when you finally look at them honestly. 6 months ago, Theresa had started taking her phone into the bathroom when she received calls. Before that, she had always spoken openly. Now her voice through the door had a softness I had not heard her use with me in many years. When I had asked once, casually, who she was talking to, she had said it was her sister, and she had said it too quickly. 5 months ago, she had begun having girls' nights with her sister at a hotel in Newport, Rhode Island, which was an hour and a half from our house in Quincy. She had told me her sister wanted a getaway. She had told me they did wine tastings. She had brought home no wine. 4 months ago, she had moved into the guest bedroom. She had told me it was because of her insomnia. She had said my snoring was making it worse. I had bought her a white noise machine. She had not used it. 3 months ago, she had stopped flinching when I touched her shoulder. She had begun simply moving away. And then there was Sophia, my quiet, watchful Sophia. She had been quieter than usual. She had been watching me with an expression that I had assumed was the natural curiosity of a child growing up. Now I understood it had been something else. She had been measuring me, measuring whether her father was the kind of man who could survive what was coming. I sat on the cold marble bench. I thought of my mother. Lucia had pulled me aside 3 weeks earlier in her kitchen. She had been peeling potatoes for sugo. She had said to me, in the soft Italian I had grown up hearing, "Frankie, qualcosa non va con Theresa. Something is wrong with Theresa. I feel it." I had laughed. I had patted her shoulder. I had said, "Mama, Theresa loves us. Theresa loves Sophia." My mother had not laughed back. She had returned to her potatoes. I sat on that marble bench and felt the recess ticking down. I did not yet understand that my brother Marco's funeral, 7 autumns earlier, had not been the end of my grief. It had been the beginning of something far worse. My right hand had been aching for almost a year. Only in the morning. Only the way an old wound aches before rain. I had told the orthopedist about it in March, and he had said, "You are 58 years old, Mr. Morelli. Your body is going to tell you things you do not want to hear." I had taken a prescription for a cream that did not work. I had not thought about it again. Sitting on that marble bench, I lifted my right hand into the morning light and stared at the small bend of my thumb, and I understood that the pain had begun the morning after Thanksgiving last year. Theresa had cooked that night. She had not cooked for years. Not for me. But the holiday had pulled something nostalgic out of her. Or so I had thought. She made my mother's recipe for ossobuco, the one Lucia had taught her in the first year of our marriage, when Theresa had still wanted to learn. The kitchen had smelled like home. After dinner, Theresa had brought me a small glass of something warm and amber. "It is an herbal tea," she had said. "Lavender and chamomile. For your back. You always look so tired, dear." I had been surprised. She had not called me dear in a long time. I had drunk the tea. I had told her it was good. I had gone to bed at 10 o'clock, and I had slept the deepest, heaviest sleep I had slept in years. My dreams had been blurred and shapeless, like a window covered in steam. When I woke up the next morning, my right hand felt strange. Not painful, exactly. More as if I had used it for something that I could not remember. The thumb was stiff. The fingers felt heavy. I flexed them open and closed under the bathroom light and thought, "You are getting old. Frank, you are not the man you used to be." I went to my mother's house that morning. the way I always did the day after a holiday. I drank coffee with her at her small table on Salem Street, and I told her about Theresa's tea. I expected her to be pleased. Lucia had always wanted Theresa and me to be closer. I expected her to say, "See, Frankie, she still loves you." But Lucia had not said that. She had looked at me for a long, quiet moment. Then she had stood up, walked to her sink, and washed her hands twice. She had not spoken about it again. I slowly turned my right hand over on the marble bench. The skin was the same skin that had held my daughter when she was newly born. But I understood now that something had been done to it that I had not consented to. Something that involved a glass of warm tea, a slow, heavy sleep, and a man named Stephen Caldwell waiting in our hallway with a stack of paperwork. I closed my eyes. I let my mind drift further back. Past Thanksgiving, past the strange aches, past the gradual erosion of my marriage, all the way back to a cold October morning in 2017, when my brother Marco was lowered into the ground at Holy Cross Cemetery in Malden, and Stephen Caldwell stood beside me in a black suit, holding the second handle of a coffin that should have been heavier than it was. Marco had been a quiet man, a bookkeeper. He had never married. He had lived with our mother for the last 8 months of his life, after the pancreatic cancer had been found too late to do anything but soften the leaving. He had been 48 years old. He had been my only brother. When he had died on a Tuesday morning in October, I had driven from the restaurant to my mother's house with the white knuckles of a man who already knew what was waiting inside. The funeral was held 3 days later. Stephen Caldwell had arrived in the dark hours of the morning to help me with the arrangements. He had handled the funeral home. He had handled the cemetery. He had handled the priest. He had handled me in his quiet, capable way, and I had been grateful in a way I did not know how to express, because Italian men of my generation did not tell each other we loved them. We carried coffins for each other instead. At the wake, my mother Lucia had worn a black scarf she would not remove for 6 months. She had stood beside Marco's casket, the way old Italian women stand beside their lost sons, holding a rosary. People had whispered to me all afternoon that Stephen was a wonderful friend. Frank. They had said, "He is the brother you always needed." Stephen had wept at the wake. I had watched it from across the room. He had wept the way men weep when they want others to remember that they wept. And then, when the wake ended, he had taken Theresa by the arm and walked her gently to the parking lot, because she had been so devastated that she could not bring herself to drive home alone. I had not been devastated enough to notice anything. I had been holding my mother upright. I had been carrying my brother's name in the small box of my chest that I had not yet learned how to open, but Lucia had noticed. I understood that now. She had stood at the casket in her black scarf, with her sister Maria Russo at her elbow, and she had watched Stephen guide Theresa toward the parking lot. She had said something soft in Italian, very close to Maria's ear. Maria had said nothing back. The two sisters had simply stood there, watching, while my brother was loaded into the hearse. I opened my eyes in the courthouse hallway. I looked through the open doorway to the courtroom, where Stephen Caldwell was now adjusting his tie and arranging his briefcase. I thought, I trusted him with my brother's memory. I trusted him with my wife while I broke down at the grave. I should have seen the way she leaned on him for too long. I almost did not return to the morning that should have told me everything. It had been buried so far under the kindness of my best friend, and the silence of my mother, and the half-light of my own willful blindness, that the memory had nearly become folklore. But I remembered it now. sitting in that courthouse hallway. I remembered the morning after my brother Marco was buried. I had slept on the living room sofa that night. Theresa had told me, in a soft, broken voice, that her grief was so deep she needed to lie alone in our bed. Stephen had offered to stay in our guest room, in case any of us needed someone steady. I had been grateful. I had thanked him with the kind of gratitude that requires no words. I had fallen asleep at 3 o'clock in the morning with my forehead pressed against the leather arm of our sofa. When I had woken at 6:30, the house had smelled like coffee. Not the espresso I made every morning. Real American coffee. The kind Theresa preferred. I had stumbled into the kitchen in my wrinkled funeral shirt to find Stephen Caldwell at our stove, in a pair of pajamas he had brought with him for the overnight stay. He was pouring milk into a mug. He had turned to me with the small, embarrassed smile of a man caught being too useful. "I made you coffee," he had said. "You look like you need it." I had thanked him. I had taken the mug. I had wondered, in a small, ungenerous corner of my mind, why he was wearing pajamas in my house instead of the spare clothes he kept in his car for emergencies. But Stephen had been my friend for so long that I had let the thought slide off me the way water slides off a leaf. Then Sophia had appeared. She was 2 years old. She had toddled in from the hallway in her pink fleece pajamas, holding her stuffed lamb. Her eyes had landed on me first, and then on Stephen, and then on the coffee mug in his hand. And she had run, on her unsteady toddler legs, not to me, but to him. She had wrapped her small arms around his calf, and she had said, very clearly, "Good morning, Daddy Stephen." I had laughed. I had laughed the way exhausted. Grieving fathers laugh at the small confusions of small children. "Sophia," I had said, "that is Uncle Stephen. Daddy is over here." She had blinked at me. She had walked over and hugged my leg too, and I had picked her up and held her against my shoulder. And I had told myself that toddlers confuse names every day. Stephen had laughed with me. He had ruffled Sophia's hair. He had said, "Kids. What can you do?" My mother Lucia had arrived at our front door 20 minutes later, bringing fresh sfogliatella from the bakery on Salem Street. She had walked into the kitchen and stopped at the threshold. She had seen Stephen at our stove in his pajamas. She had seen the second coffee mug on our counter, the one Theresa always used, still warm and half-empty beside the toaster. She had seen the way Sophia had run back toward Stephen for a second hug. Lucia had said nothing. She had set the pastry box on the table. She had kissed me on the forehead. She had walked back out the front door without taking off her coat. She had not returned that day. When I had called her that evening to ask if she was all right, she had said only, "Frankie, I have a headache. We will speak tomorrow." I sat on the marble bench in the courthouse hallway, with my hands folded in my lap. And I understood that my mother had not had a headache. My mother had walked into my kitchen on the morning after my brother's burial and seen, with the clarity of a woman who had lived through 2 wars and 1 widowhood, exactly what was happening in my house. I began to count the moments I had refused to count for the last 7 years. The first Christmas after Marco's death, Stephen had appeared at our family dinner with a designer scarf for Theresa wrapped in expensive paper. He had brought nothing for me. I had told myself he had been planning to wait, that my gift would arrive separately, that I had no right to count Christmas presents at the age of 51. The summer of 2019. Stephen had begun stopping by our house on Sunday afternoons when I was at the restaurant. He had told me he was checking on Theresa. I had told him he was a good friend. The pandemic year. Stephen and Theresa had run errands together while I had managed the takeout pivot at Morelli's. Stephen had been single, recently divorced, and lonely. I had told myself he needed company. Every birthday Theresa had celebrated for the last 7 years. Stephen had given her a card with handwriting so careful it must have taken him an hour. I had given her flowers from the same grocer I had used for 22 years, and Sophia, my Sophia. She had begun watching Stephen, and watching Theresa, and watching me, with that small, measuring expression of hers. In April of this year, I had thought she was practicing for a school play. I had thought she was growing curious about adult conversation. I lifted my eyes to the gallery, where my 9-year-old daughter sat on a wooden bench, clutching the small kitchen apron I had sewn for her when she was 4. She was looking back at me, and in her brown eyes was the same patient, watchful expression she had been wearing for 8 months. She was the only person in that entire building, in that entire family, in that entire long-buried decade, who had seen the truth before her father had been willing to look at it. The bailiff called the end of recess at 5 minutes to 11. I rose from the marble bench more slowly than I had sat down on it. My back had stiffened in the cold air of that hallway, and my mind had stiffened too, in a way that felt almost like clarity. I was thinking about Sophia. I was thinking about the way she had run to Stephen instead of to me on the morning after my brother's burial. I was thinking about how a child of 2 knows things that her father will not allow himself to know for another 7 years. I started to walk back toward courtroom 408. Then I felt a small hand on my sleeve. She had come into the hallway without making a sound. My 9-year-old daughter, with the small navy apron folded over her left arm, with her hair in the simple braid my mother had woven for her that morning. She did not speak. She tugged my sleeve and led me toward the stone staircase at the far end of the corridor, where the marble curved up and an old window looked across Pemberton Square. There was a small landing there, shadowed and quiet. She turned to face me. She tilted her chin up the way she did when she was about to say something she had practiced. "Daddy," she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Uncle Stephen is a bad man." I knelt down. The pain in my back protested. I did not care. I put my hands gently on her shoulders. The fabric of her dress was thin under my palms. Her bones felt small. They felt like they would always be small. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I said. She drew a breath that was older than her years. "He kissed Mommy in our kitchen," she said. "I saw." It was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on a Wednesday in August. I was supposed to be at piano lessons. Miss Davenport had a migraine. I came home early. They did not hear me come in. I went to the dining room. I watched. I did not say anything. She looked into my eyes the way she had been looking into them for 8 months. With patience. With apology. With a courage that should not have been required of her. "I have other things too, Daddy. I have a lot of other things. I have them on my tablet." My mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. The walls of the staircase felt cold against my back. I could hear, somewhere down the hallway, the soft scrape of Stephen Caldwell's leather shoes on the marble floor, walking back toward our table. "Sophia," I said, and my voice did not sound like my own. "Did Uncle Stephen do anything to you? Did he ever touch you?" She shook her head firmly. "No, Daddy. He was nice to me. He bought me ice cream. He told me I was his favorite. But he is a bad man. He is a bad man because he kisses Mommy, and because Mommy lies to you, and because of other things. Bigger things." I felt the wood of the banister against my palm. I felt the cold of the courthouse passing through the soles of my old leather shoes. I felt the weight of 7 years of small dismissals collapsing all at once into the bones of my chest. A shadow appeared on the marble step beside us. My mother, Lucia, stood there in her black scarf, holding her old wooden cane. Having climbed the 3 steps from the hallway in complete silence the way old Italian women climb stairs when they do not wish to be heard, she placed her hand on Sophia's small cheek. She spoke in a voice softer than I had ever known it to be, a voice she had not used since I was a small boy. "Coraggio, bambina," she said. "Coraggio. Courage, little one. Courage." She turned her dark eyes to me, and she gave me a single, slow nod. The nod of a woman who had been waiting 22 years for this exact moment. The nod of a mother who had finally been given permission to step out of the shadow she had been standing in. Then she walked back down the staircase without another word and disappeared into the gallery. I picked Sophia up. She was 9 years old and tall for her age. But I picked her up the way I had picked her up at 5 and at 3 and at 1. I held her against my chest. I felt her small heart beating against the place where my own heart had broken without my noticing it. "You did nothing wrong," I said into her hair. "Whatever you have, whatever you saw, you did nothing wrong." "I know," she said calmly. "I just needed you to know first." The bailiff called my name from the courtroom door. I set Sophia gently on her feet. I straightened my tie with hands that no longer felt like my hands. I walked back into courtroom 408 with my daughter's small fingers laced through 3 of mine. Patricia Cole had finished her opening statement. Theresa was being called to the stand. She walked to the witness chair the way she walked through restaurants, with the practiced poise of a woman who had been told her whole life that she belonged at the center of every room. She placed her left hand on the Bible the bailiff held out, raised her right hand, and swore, in a clear, steady voice, to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help her God. She did not look at me. She did not look at Sophia. She looked, instead, at Stephen Caldwell, and gave him the smallest, briefest smile. Sophia leaned toward me on the wooden bench. Her mouth came close to my ear. Her voice was quieter than the courtroom air. "Daddy," she said, "I am going to do it now." Theresa began with a smile. It was not a wide smile. It was the controlled, polite smile of a woman who had been trained for 30 years by her own family to take elegant pictures at weddings and funerals alike. She turned her head 3 degrees to face Judge Sullivan, exactly the way she had practiced in front of the bathroom mirror that morning, and she began, in a voice tuned to maximum sincerity, to lie under oath. "My husband is a wonderful provider, Your Honor," she said. "I want to begin by saying that he has worked hard for this family for 22 years. He has loved my daughter, but Frank has not been present. He has not been emotionally present for me, or for Sophia, for the entirety of our marriage. I have raised our daughter alone. I have managed our household alone. I have built a life out of the absences he left behind, because he was always at his restaurant, and his restaurant was always more important than I was. I sat at the table and listened to my wife perform a version of me I did not recognize. I was an absent father, a controlling husband, a man who had forgotten his wife's birthday twice in 22 years, which I had not. I was a man whose temper had grown sharper with age, which it had not. Every sentence was constructed with enough truth at its edges to make the lie at the center of it sound plausible. She had practiced this for weeks, probably for months, possibly, I now understood, for years. Patricia Cole nodded at every word, the way a music teacher nods at a student playing scales correctly. Stephen Caldwell, beside me, kept his face arranged in the composition of a friend hearing painful but truthful testimony about another friend. Once or twice he reached toward me as if to offer his hand. I did not allow him to find it. The testimony continued for 31 minutes. By the end of it, Theresa had wept twice, in carefully timed intervals, and had apologized to the court for the difficulty of speaking against the father of her child. Patricia Cole had paced beside the witness stand, the way a fisherman paces beside a steady, gentle line. And then Patricia Cole turned to her and asked the question that broke open the rest of the morning. Has Sophia ever come to you, in private, and told you that her father had emotionally neglected her? Theresa drew a breath that was meant to look brave. Yes, she said. She has. She has told me more than once that she does not feel close to her father, that she feels invisible to him, that she has stopped expecting him to remember the things that matter to her. I felt my daughter's small body stand up beside me. The motion was so quiet, so undramatic, that for a moment I thought she had only shifted her weight on the bench. But she was standing. She was holding her small navy apron pressed against her chest with one hand. She had raised the other hand, gently, palm forward, the way children raise their hands in school when they have an important question to ask. Judge Sullivan saw her first. The judge had been watching Theresa with the practiced attention of a 31-year veteran of the family court bench, and her eyes shifted, almost involuntarily, to the small, upraised hand of the child in the gallery. Yes, the judge said gently. Sophia, was it? Yes, ma'am, Sophia said. Her voice was clearer than any voice I had ever heard her use. Your Honor, may I please show you something my daddy does not know? The courtroom went still in a way that I had only experienced once before. When my brother Marco took his last breath in my mother's arms, even the air seemed to hold its position. Patricia Cole rose to her feet. Your Honor, with respect, she said quickly. The child has not been called as a witness. She has not been prepared by counsel. We object to any spontaneous testimony from a minor in this proceeding. I just want to show the truth, Sophia said. She did not look at Patricia. She looked at the judge. Theresa's face had drained of color. The hand she had been resting on the witness stand was trembling now. Stephen Caldwell, beside me, had gone very still. His breathing had become shallow. The eyebrow above his right eye had lifted 0.5 millimeter. In a way that no one else in that courtroom would have noticed, because no one else in that courtroom had been studying his face for 35 years. Judge Sullivan leaned forward. Sophia, the judge said, in a careful, kind voice. Do you wish to testify? Do you understand what that means? Yes, ma'am, Sophia said. I understand. I want to. I have practiced. I am ready. The judge looked, for one long moment, at Patricia Cole, then at Theresa, then at me. Her gaze rested on me the longest. She was asking, I understood, whether I, as the father, would consent. I gave her one small, quiet nod. The bailiff brought a small cushion and helped Sophia onto the witness stand. He had to adjust the microphone downward to find her mouth. He had to place a folded blanket behind her back so she could sit forward. Her legs swung above the floor in a pair of small black shoes that had been polished the night before. She set her navy apron carefully on her lap. She set a small black tablet on top of the apron. She looked once at me, and only once. The way a soldier looks at his father before going into a fight he has prepared for his entire life. Then she spoke into the microphone. Your Honor, she said, I am going to play 5 videos. I think we should start with the first one. It was filmed last month, but the part that matters happened 7 years ago. Sophia pressed her thumb against the screen of her small black tablet, and the courtroom became a stage for things I had never wanted to know. The first video began as an audio recording, Sophia explained, in the calm voice of a child who had practiced explaining difficult things that she had not always been close enough to film. Sometimes she had hidden her tablet behind a framed picture or under a cushion where only the sound could reach it. On the afternoon of this first recording, she had hidden her tablet behind the toaster in our kitchen. The voices that came through the courtroom speakers were unmistakable. The first voice was my wife of 22 years. The second voice was my best friend of 35. I want to remember when. Stephen was saying, I want to remember the exact moment. People ask me sometimes, when I get drunk enough, when did you fall in love? And I never have a good answer. You have a good answer, Theresa said. You just do not want to say it out loud. I want you to say it. There was a pause on the recording. I could hear the soft clink of 2 glasses touching. I could hear the muffled hum of the small refrigerator in my own kitchen. I could hear the radio I had left on that morning. A sports station I had been listening to for years. It was Marco's funeral, Theresa said. A second pause. Longer this time. Marco's funeral. Stephen repeated. The most honest day of my life. The day I held you in the parking lot of Holy Cross Cemetery, and you did not pull away. The day your husband was so broken he did not even notice his wife had stopped being his wife. Marco's funeral was the best day of our lives. Theresa. That was when I knew. I knew it too, Theresa said. I have known it for 7 years. The audio file ended. The silence that replaced it in the courtroom was thicker than any silence I had ever heard. I could not feel my hands. I could not feel my feet. I could feel only a sound inside my own chest that did not belong to me. A sound that I would later understand was the sound of a man's last innocent assumption breaking inside its small protective bone. 7 years of explanations rearranged themselves in my head all at once. Every Sunday visit, every birthday card, every time he had walked Theresa to the parking lot after a family dinner. The same 7 years I had spent paying their bills, hosting their dinners, calling Stephen my brother. I had not been blind. I had simply refused to see. Patricia Cole did not move. Theresa was staring at the witness stand with the eyes of a woman watching her own death rehearsed. Stephen Caldwell, beside me, had stopped breathing entirely. In the gallery, I saw my mother Lucia, and beside her, her sister Maria Russo. Lucia's hand had risen to her own mouth. Maria's face had gone the color of winter ash. I understood, in a single dim instant, that Maria was the mother of the woman who had just been heard, on courtroom speakers, calling my brother's funeral the best day of her life. Maria's hand found Lucia's. The 2 old sisters laced their fingers together and did not let go. The judge spoke very quietly. Sophia, she said. Is there a second video? Yes, ma'am, Sophia said. Her voice had not wavered. There are 4 more. The next one is shorter. It was filmed in our kitchen. 3 weeks ago. She pressed her thumb against the screen a second time. The video opened on the warm light of my own kitchen. The small overhead bulb above the cutting station. The yellow notepad I used for my morning notes, resting on the counter beside the phone, and the wooden olive board my grandfather Antonio had carved by hand in 1958. The board that had lived on every kitchen counter of the Morelli family for 66 years. Theresa walked into the frame. She was wearing a pale pink blouse I had bought her for her birthday 2 years ago. The same blouse I had once told her made her look like the woman I had married. She was carrying 2 glasses of wine. She crossed the kitchen and stopped beside the table, where Stephen Caldwell sat in a position I had been seeing in my own kitchen for 15 years. The seat he had always taken, beside the window, in my house. She set the glasses down. She did not sit. She placed both of her hands on the back of his neck. She lowered her face to his. She kissed him for a long time, slowly, in the kitchen where I had peeled garlic that very morning, on a Wednesday in September, 3 weeks ago. His hand had risen to the small of her back, the way a husband's hand rises, the way mine should have been rising, in my own kitchen, on every morning of the last 7 years. When she finally lifted her face away, Stephen smiled at her. "He is at the restaurant," she said softly. "He won't be home for hours." "He's never home." "Soon," Stephen said. "Soon we will not have to hide." The video ended. I gripped the edge of the wooden table with both hands. The table had been the same table I had eaten breakfast at for 22 years. The kitchen had been the same kitchen my mother had cooked sugo in for the first 3 years of my marriage. The olive board had been carved by hands that I shared blood with, and my wife had used all 3 of them as the staging ground for the destruction of my family. I closed my eyes. I felt tears, the silent tears of an Italian father, running down my face for the first time since my brother Marco died. I opened my eyes. I looked at my 9-year-old daughter on the witness stand. She was looking at me with patience, with quiet courage, with the calm of a child who had carried a secret for 8 months and was finally setting it down. "Show me everything, princess," I said. My voice was rough as bread crust. "Show me everything. Whatever else is on that tablet. I am ready." She nodded once. The smallest, most adult nod I have ever seen on the face of a child. "The 3rd video," Sophia said, "is from August of this year. It was filmed in our living room. I was supposed to be at Maddie Harrigan's birthday party. I came home early because I forgot my present. I did not announce that I had come in. I left my tablet propped on top of the bookshelf, the one with the pictures of Grandpa Antonio." She pressed her thumb against the screen. The video opened on the small leather chair beside our fireplace, the chair my father had taught me to read inside, the chair I had read to Sophia from when she was small enough to fit inside it. Stephen Caldwell was sitting in that chair. He was laughing. "You should have seen his face at her baptism," Stephen was saying. "I almost ruined it. Theresa." I almost laughed. I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. Theresa, off camera, was laughing too. The laugh I had not heard in our house for several years. It was a real laugh, low and easy. "I held that kid at her baptism," Stephen said. "I held her in front of God, in front of the priest, in front of his entire crying family. I said the words. I cried real tears, Theresa, real tears, and the whole congregation thought I was the kindest godfather in Boston. You were so convincing," Theresa said. "The priest believed you. Frank cried so hard he could not breathe. His mother was the only one who did not clap. Did you ever notice that she just sat there? Did not move." "Lucia knows," Stephen said, casually, as if commenting on the weather. "Lucia has always known. She has never said anything. 22 years, and she has never said a word." "Italian women," Stephen said. "They wait." There was a soft clink on the recording. 2 glasses. A small toast to 22 years of waiting. The video ended. I do not know if I made a sound. I do not know if I stood up. I know only that I was on my feet, gripping the back of my chair, and that my hand had moved, of its own accord, toward the place over my heart where the small wooden crucifix I had been given at my own baptism had been pinned inside my undershirt for the better part of my entire life. Italian Catholic men do not joke about baptisms. We do not joke about godfather vows. We do not stand at a stone font in a church our grandparents were married in and swear something in front of God that we intend to break before the wineglass dries. Stephen Caldwell had done all three of those things in less than 4 minutes, in my own living room, while my mother sat 15 miles away on Salem Street, folding her hands and waiting. "Sit down, Mr. Morelli," the judge said gently. "There are 2 more videos. Take a breath." I sat. The chair felt smaller than it had 10 minutes before. "The 4th one," Sophia said quietly. "The 4th one is the hardest." "Daddy, I am sorry." She pressed play one more time. The video opened on a darkened kitchen. The clock above the stove read 12:38 in the morning. The light came from a single bulb above the sink, and from the small lamp Theresa had brought down from the upstairs hallway. The kitchen looked like the night after Thanksgiving last year. Sophia, watching the video now alongside us, spoke gently into the microphone. "I had hidden under the dining room table," she said. "I had brought my tablet with me. I had heard Mommy whisper to Uncle Stephen the night before that he should come over after Daddy fell asleep. I knew something was wrong. I lay very still on the wood floor. I held the tablet against my chest. I did not make a sound. On the screen, Theresa walked into the kitchen. Stephen Caldwell walked in behind her. He was carrying a brown leather portfolio. He set it on the kitchen island. He opened it. Inside, I could see a stack of legal documents, each one tabbed at the bottom with a small pink arrow. "Where is he?" Stephen asked. "On the couch," Theresa said. "Out cold. I gave him a double dose this time." Stephen nodded. He walked out of the kitchen, off camera, and I could hear his footsteps moving toward the living room. He returned in less than a minute, supporting the limp body of a man whose head hung forward and whose right arm dangled at his side. The man was me. Stephen lowered me into a kitchen chair. He propped my head against the back of it. He took my right hand in both of his hands the way a healer takes a hand. He pressed the pen into my fingers. He guided my hand across the bottom of the first page. He guided it across the second. He guided it across the third. He moved my thumb to a small wet ink pad and pressed it onto the 4th. He worked patiently, the way a man works who has done this exact thing once or twice before. 2.4 million on the restaurant, Stephen said softly, more to himself than to her. 1.8 on his life. "We are almost done." "He keeps holding the pen wrong," Theresa whispered. "He always did," Stephen said. "He always did." When the last page was signed, Stephen lifted my limp arm and let it fall against my own chest. He patted my cheek once. He smiled at Theresa. "He is going to die a very wealthy widow," Stephen said. "We just have to get him into that kitchen." The video ended. I rose to my feet a second time. My mouth moved before I had decided what it would say. "They forged my hand." I heard myself say to no one in the courtroom. "They forged my hand," like I was already a corpse. In the gallery, Maria Russo had begun to weep into a folded handkerchief. Lucia did not weep. Lucia simply tightened her grip on her sister's hand and stared, without blinking, at her own daughter-in-law. "Yes, Daddy," Sophia said softly into the microphone. "There are still 2 more videos. The last one is the worst." I sat back down at the table because I no longer trusted my legs to hold me. The wood under my palms felt warm and humid from my own sweating. My hands were shaking the way a young cook's hands shake the first time he holds a knife in a professional kitchen. I had become a different man in the last 25 minutes. I had become a man who had been buried while still breathing, by people who had been pretending to love him for 7 years. Stephen Caldwell sat beside me. He had not moved during the last reveal. He was very still in the way that wax is still. The eyebrow above his right eye had not lowered. He was listening to the room around him the way a hunted animal listens to the trees. The 5th video, Sophia said, came 2 days ago. She was speaking more carefully now, as if each sentence had to be measured for the weight it carried. I had followed Mommy out of the house. She drove to the restaurant. I had hidden in the back seat of her car under the picnic blanket. When she went inside, I waited for her to go down to the basement. Then I climbed out of the car and went in through the kitchen door, because I have a key. I left my tablet on the spice shelf next to the rosemary jar. Then I went home before she finished. She did not look at her mother as she said this. She did not need to. She pressed her thumb against the screen. The video opened on the inside of my own restaurant kitchen. I knew the angle immediately. The spice shelf I had built in 1993 with my brother Marco, the year before he stopped working at the restaurant for good. The shelf where Lucia's rosemary jar had been refilled by hand every Sunday for 31 years. Stephen Caldwell entered the frame. He was holding his briefcase. He walked across the kitchen with the practiced step of a man who had been in that kitchen many times. A second man entered behind him. He was shorter than Stephen, wider in the shoulders, with the heavy walk of a man who had spent his life in industries that required quiet feet. His name, I would learn later, was Tony Brennan. He worked out of Providence. He had a federal record. He owned a small electrical contracting company that had served as a useful cover for 30 years. He took off his black overcoat. He set it on a kitchen counter the way a man sets a coat down in a place he is comfortable in. He did not introduce himself. "I have everything you need," Stephen said quietly to Tony Brennan. "The blueprints, the wiring history, the insurance. The kitchen is older than I am, so an electrical fire would not even need an explanation. 65-year-old Italian restaurant, bad wiring, old gas line. These things happen." He had brought a folder with him. He set it on the prep counter beside the spice shelf. He opened it. He spread 3 sheets of paper across the stainless steel. 40, Tony Brennan said. "Not $1 less. And I work alone." 40,000, Stephen said. "I have it in cash. You will have it tomorrow." "When?" Tony said. Stephen looked at his watch in the way a man looks at his watch when he wants to feel important. He paused. He chose his words. He said, "December." Tony Brennan tilted his head. "December what?" Stephen smiled the kind of smile I had seen him give only a few times in our 35-year friendship. It was the smile he used in courtrooms when he was about to win a difficult case. The smile of a man who had been planning something for so long that the planning had become a small, dark pleasure of its own. "The anniversary," Stephen said, "December 14th. 22 years of being married to him. She wants the symmetry. December 14th. The date I had stood beside Theresa at St. Leonard's Church and promised, before the same God, to love her until I died. "There is more," she said quietly. "But you should hear something else first." "Your Honor." "Then I will play the rest." She lifted her eyes to the gallery. In the gallery, my mother Lucia rose to her feet. She rose slowly, the way old women rise after sitting on a hard wooden bench for the better part of an hour. She rose with the help of her wooden cane, the cane that had belonged to my grandfather Antonio. Her black mourning scarf was tied tight under her chin. Her shoulders were narrow, but they were squared in a way I had not seen them squared since the morning of my father's funeral. She walked to the wooden railing that separated the gallery from the courtroom floor. "Your Honor," she said, "may I please address the court?" Her voice was clear. Her English was perfect. Not a single Italian word in it. Not a single broken consonant. Not the kind of fractured English I had heard her speak in front of my friends, my colleagues, my wife and her family for 22 years. The English of a woman who had been to school. The English of a woman who had been listening. Judge Sullivan blinked once. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am," the judge said. "Of course you may." Maria Russo rose to her feet beside her sister. She did not speak. She placed her hand at the small of Lucia's back the way Italian sisters have steadied each other for 2 centuries on this continent. Lucia turned to face the courtroom. Her eyes passed over Patricia Cole. They passed over Theresa, who had begun to tremble. They passed over Stephen Caldwell, who had stopped breathing for the second time that morning. "I have been waiting 22 years to say this," my mother said. In a voice none of you have ever heard. She drew a breath. Then she paused. She turned her dark eyes to Sophia on the witness stand. "Finish the video first, Bambina," she said gently. "They need to hear the worst part before they hear me. Your daddy needs to hear it." Sophia obeyed her grandmother the way Italian children obey Italian grandmothers. Without question. Without delay. Without any flicker of doubt. She lifted her thumb and pressed it against the screen. The video resumed on the same kitchen. Stephen Caldwell standing beside the spice shelf. Tony Brennan with both hands on the prep counter, the folder still open between them. Now Tony Brennan, who had spent his entire professional life making things appear to be accidents, asked the question that no honest man on earth ever has to ask. "And the husband," he said. "Where is the husband when this fire goes?" Stephen Caldwell did not hesitate. His voice did not change pitch. There was nothing in his face that would have suggested that the man he was discussing had once been called his brother. "He'll be in that kitchen," Stephen said, "late at night, closing the restaurant the way he always does, last to leave, last to lock the doors, last to count the cash. The fire starts after he's been alone for an hour. He goes down with the building." Tony Brennan nodded slowly. He did not appear surprised. He did not appear pleased. He appeared, instead, the way a man appears when he has been told the weather forecast. Then a third voice joined the recording. Theresa walked into the frame. She was wearing a black wool coat that I had bought for her in Boston 2 winters ago, on a December afternoon when we had walked along Newbury Street together, and I had told her that her eyes were prettier when she was cold. She was carrying a small leather bag. She set it on the prep counter. "The cash is in the bag," she said. She turned to Tony Brennan. She smiled the smile of a woman who had been preparing to be a widow for a long time. The smile she had worn at every dinner party for the last 7 years. The smile she had worn at Marco's wake. 1.8 million in life insurance, Stephen said quietly. 2.4 million on the restaurant building, plus the property itself, plus the land, plus the value of the marital settlement we'll be free of, because the divorce will not have been finalized. Easy money, clean grief. We close in February. Beach house in Naples. Just like we planned. Stephen looked over at her. He smiled in a way I had never seen him smile before. The smile of a man who had finally been allowed to take off a mask he had been wearing for 3.5 decades. "To February," Theresa said. "To February," Stephen agreed. Tony Brennan picked up the bag. He did not count the money. Men in his line of work do not count money in front of other men. He nodded once. He walked out of the frame. The video ended. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room. It was the silence of a small, sealed planet where nothing had ever lived. I did not feel my body. I did not feel the table. I did not feel the wedding ring on my left hand. I felt only the small, distant ring of my own heartbeat inside the chamber of my chest. As if someone were striking a hammer against a bell at the far end of a long, empty church, somewhere far away. My hand reached for my wedding ring. I twisted it once around my finger the way I had twisted it every night for 22 years. Then I let my hand fall back to the table. Judge Eleanor Sullivan rose to her feet behind the bench. Her face had drained of color. Her eyes had become the color of cold steel. She had been a judge for 31 years. She had presided over 412 divorce hearings. She had seen many things. She had not seen this. "Bailiff," the judge said. Her voice was steady. "Detain Mr. Caldwell. Detain Mrs. Morelli. Notify the district attorney's office. This is no longer a divorce proceeding. This is a conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. With insurance fraud, with possible arson, we are going to need federal involvement." The bailiff did not hesitate. He had been a Boston bailiff for 19 years. He had pulled his own children out of fires twice. He walked across the courtroom floor and placed a heavy, professional hand on Stephen Caldwell's shoulder. "Stand up, Mr. Caldwell," the bailiff said quietly. Stephen did not stand. His eyes had gone glassy. His mouth had opened slightly, the way a man's mouth opens when his body has not yet caught up to the information his mind has received. The composure he had practiced for 30 years had come undone in less than 90 seconds. "I said stand up," the bailiff said. A second deputy walked over from the side of the courtroom. The two of them lifted Stephen Caldwell up by the elbows and turned him around. The deputy snapped a pair of metal handcuffs over Stephen's wrists. A small sound escaped from Stephen's throat. It was a sound I had not heard a grown man make since I had watched my father in the hospice room 6 years before he died. It was the sound a man makes when the man he has been pretending to be falls down inside him and cannot be put back up. Stephen Caldwell, the man who had stood beside me at my wedding, who had carried my brother's coffin, who had cradled my daughter at her baptism, had finally been seen for what he was, and the seeing had broken him in front of the entire courtroom. He looked at me as the deputies guided him toward the side door of the courtroom. His face was the face of a stranger. His mouth opened. Whatever he wanted to say. He did not say it. I rose to my feet. I did not look at Theresa. I did not look at Patricia Cole. I did not look at my mother in the gallery, or at Maria Russo, or even at Sophia on the witness stand. I looked at Stephen Caldwell, and I waited until the bailiff had stopped him at the door. Because I had something to say to him that I had spent 35 years not knowing I would ever need to say. I walked across the floor of courtroom 408, with steps I had not used in many years. They were the slow, even, fully grounded steps of an Italian father walking toward a man who had broken something that could not be repaired. The kind of steps my father had walked the night a delivery driver had stolen 40 pounds of veal from our cellar in 1976. The kind of steps my grandfather Antonio had walked the morning my own father had come home with a black eye from a school fight. The bailiff stopped at the door. He looked at Judge Sullivan. The judge gave him a single, careful nod. Stephen Caldwell stood between the two deputies. His hands were locked behind his back. His shoulders had collapsed inward in a way that made him appear smaller than the man I had known. His face was wet. His hair had come loose across his forehead. He looked, for the first time in his 65 years of careful self-construction, like a man who had been seen all the way through. "Frank," he said. His voice cracked. "Frank." Please, brother, please. I stood 3 feet away from him. I did not raise my voice. Italian fathers, in moments of true confrontation, do not raise their voices. We use them the way our own fathers used them, quietly, with the weight of every man who has stood in our family before us. You called me brother for 35 years. I said. I did not blink. You stood beside me at the altar of St. Leonard's Church, and you held my wedding ring in a steady hand. You kissed the forehead of my newborn daughter at her baptism. You carried my brother Marco's coffin out of Holy Cross Cemetery in the cold rain of October. You sat at my kitchen table for 15 years, and you let my mother feed you sugo on Sundays. You drank my wine. You wore the cologne I gave you for your 50th birthday. You allowed me to call you brother in front of every man, woman, and child in the North End of Boston, and you used all of it, every minute of it, to plan to burn me alive in my own kitchen on the morning of my 22nd wedding anniversary. I paused. The courtroom did not move. Stephen had begun to weep, not the performance tears of his 30 years of trial practice. Real tears. The kind of tears a man only learns to weep when something inside him has finally fallen down and has nowhere left to land. I will spend the rest of my days, I said, teaching my daughter that men like you exist. That is the only gift you have ever given my family. He sank. Then, his knees folded. The 2 deputies caught him on either side. They did not let him kneel. They held him up because the law required them to walk him through the door of the courtroom in a posture that would not look like a confession on camera. They walked him forward. The side door closed behind them with the soft, definitive sound of a door closing on 35 years of a single, fictional friendship. I turned away from the door. I walked across the floor of courtroom 408 in the opposite direction. I walked past Patricia Cole, who did not look up from her papers. I walked past Theresa, who had begun to cry in a way I did not recognize because I had not heard her cry honestly in many years. I did not stop. I did not look at her. I walked, instead, toward the witness stand, where my 9-year-old daughter sat with her hands folded over the small navy apron in her lap. I did not climb the steps to the stand. I did not need to. I knelt in front of her, on the cold floor of the courtroom, the way fathers in my family had been kneeling in front of their daughters for the better part of 4 generations. My knees made a sound I had not heard them make in some time. I did not care. Sophia, I said. My voice was rough, but it was steady. Sophia. Mia bambina. She lifted her small hand and placed it on my cheek. The fabric of her sleeve smelled like the rose water Lucia put in her own granddaughter's bath water. You did this alone, I said, for 8 months. While I was failing to see, while I was being patient, while I was being a good husband and a busy restaurant owner and an idiot in my own house. You were watching. You were preparing. You were carrying a weight that no 9-year-old child should ever have to carry. I should have seen. Sophia. I should have protected you. I should have known. She did not pull her hand away from my cheek. She tilted her head the way she had been tilting it since she was small enough to fit inside the leather chair beside our fireplace. Her eyes were dry. Her eyes had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. I knew you would, Daddy, she said quietly. I knew you would. Eventually, Mama Lucia and I, we just had to wait for you. We knew you would get here. I felt the second set of tears of my adult life come down across my face. A small, dry hand came to rest on my shoulder. My mother Lucia had walked from the gallery to the witness stand without my hearing her approach. The wooden cane was beside her now. Her black scarf had not moved. Her dark eyes were on her granddaughter, and then on her son, and then back on her granddaughter again. She placed her other hand on the top of Sophia's small head, in the gesture that Italian grandmothers have used as a blessing in this country, since before the steamships had stopped coming. "She is right, figlio mio," my mother said. We waited. I did not stand up. I stayed kneeling between my mother and my daughter in the middle of a Boston courtroom, with my forehead pressed gently against the small hand that my Sophia had not yet taken away from my cheek. Lucia leaned down. "Now it is my turn." "Figlio," she said softly into my ear. "Now I will speak." I rose slowly from the floor at Sophia's feet, because my mother had asked me to. The blood had drained from my knees during the kneeling. The blood came back into them now with a slow, prickling warmth I had not felt in many years. I stood with my hand on the wooden railing of the witness stand for a moment to steady myself. Then I stepped back to the gallery side so that my mother could take the floor. Sophia remained on the witness stand, hands folded, watching her grandmother the way a small apprentice watches a master. Lucia did not climb to the witness stand. She did not need to. She had not been called as a witness in the formal sense. But Judge Sullivan watched her with the careful attention of a woman who understood that what was about to happen in this courtroom no longer belonged inside the formal rules. My mother turned to face the bench from the deep pocket of her wool skirt, the pocket she had been wearing in her dresses since I was a small boy. She withdrew a small leather notebook. It was not a new notebook. The leather had been worn so soft along its edges that it looked almost like felt. The corners were rounded the way the corners of a thing that has been carried in a pocket for decades become rounded. There was a small initial pressed into the front cover, the letter L in a faded gold. The notebook was tied closed with a thin black ribbon that had been tied and untied so many times that the ribbon itself had grown thin in the middle. My mother held the notebook up so the courtroom could see it. This notebook was made for my father in 1944 by a bookbinder in Palermo. He carried it through the war. When I was 16 years old, he gave it to me. On the morning I left Sicily for America, he told me to write down what mattered. He told me that an Italian woman who keeps her eyes open and her mouth closed will see things that the men around her will spend their whole lives missing. She paused. She did not look at Theresa. She did not need to. I have written in this notebook on the nights that mattered for 62 years. My mother said, "There are 127 written pages. I have written in Italian and in English when the English mattered. I have written about my husband when he was alive. I have written about my son Marco when he was sick. I have written, also, about my son Frank and his wife Theresa." She opened the notebook to a marked page. "I have brought 23 of those pages with me today," she said. "With your permission, Your Honor, I would like to read 3 of them into the record." The judge nodded once. "Please, ma'am." My mother adjusted her reading glasses. The lenses caught the light from the high courtroom window. Her finger touched the first marked entry of February 9th, 2002. She read, "Sunday dinner at our house. Theresa told me, while drying dishes, that the women of her family find Italian peasant cooking embarrassing. She did not believe I understood her English. I served her my mother's lasagna anyway." I waited. She turned to the second marked page, entry of October 22nd, 2017. She read, "Marco's funeral. Stephen Caldwell held Theresa's elbow in the parking lot of Holy Cross Cemetery for 58 seconds. I counted. He led her to his car. She allowed him. My Frank was inside the chapel still. I said nothing. I waited. The number 58 moved through the courtroom like a small physical object. Theresa, in her chair, lowered her head. She turned to the third marked page, entry of March 12th, 2022. She read, "I have hired a man. His name is Vinny Russo. He is a cousin of my sister Maria's late husband. He used to work for the federal government. He has agreed to follow Theresa and Stephen for me. I have given him $28,000 in cash, which I have been saving in an olive oil tin in my pantry for the better part of 40 years. The money was meant for Frank's old age. I have decided he will need the truth more than he will need the money. I waited as long as I could. Today, I have stopped waiting." She closed the notebook gently. She held it against her chest, the way a woman holds the photograph of someone she has loved for a long time. "I am sorry, Frank," my mother said quietly. She did not look at me. She was looking at the place above the witness stand where the small American flag hung from a polished brass pole. "I am sorry that I did not warn you in plain English. I am sorry that I let you live inside a house with that woman for 22 years. I had to be sure. I had to be patient. I had to wait until the proof was in the hands of a child who could not be silenced by them. I am sorry. Figlio mio. I am sorry it took so long. I did not answer her. I could not. The Italian fathers in my family did not weep in courtrooms. But the Italian fathers in my family had also never been forgiven, in public, by their mothers, for failing to see the women who had been destroying their lives. I walked across the floor of courtroom 408 a third time that morning. I did not stop until I had reached my mother. I knelt in front of her on the courtroom floor, in front of the judge, in front of the gallery, in front of the entire city of Boston. And I took her small hand in both of mine. "You have nothing to apologize for. Mama," I said, "it is I who must beg your forgiveness." She placed her free hand on the top of my head. "Then come, Figlio," she said. "I have one more person I would like the court to meet. He has been waiting in the hallway since 8 o'clock this morning. He has brought everything." My mother lifted her hand. She gestured toward the rear of the courtroom. The double doors at the back opened, and a man walked in. He was a wide-shouldered Italian-American man in his mid-60s, with thinning silver hair combed back from a heavy, intelligent face. He wore a charcoal suit that had been cut by someone who understood that a man who carries weight should not pretend to carry less. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and a thick brown accordion folder bound in a rubber band in the other. He walked down the central aisle without looking at anyone. He had the quiet, deliberate posture of a man who had spent 30 years walking into rooms exactly like this one. His name was Vincenzo Russo. People in the North End called him Vinny. He had spent 22 years as a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He had retired in 2020 and opened his own office on Hanover Street, 4 blocks from my restaurant. He was a distant cousin by marriage, and one of the most patient men I had ever met. Behind Vinny Russo, a second figure walked into the courtroom. She was a smaller woman, 50 years old or so, with short silver hair and the unmistakable carriage of an active federal agent. She wore a gray suit. A small gold badge was clipped to her belt. She walked the way people who are carrying authority walk, as if the room belonged to them by default. Special Agent Maria Delgado, Federal Bureau of Investigation. She said quietly to Judge Sullivan, "We have been working with Mr. Russo on this matter for several months. We received clearance from the United States Attorney's Office this morning." The judge nodded slowly. Welcome, Agent Delgado. The court is glad to have you. Vinny Russo set his briefcase on the floor of the courtroom and opened it. Inside were 47 folders, each carefully labeled by date and location. He did not need to take any of them out. He had spent 2 years preparing them for the day when the truth would speak in his place. He turned, instead, to the accordion folder in his left hand. He untied the rubber band. He withdrew 2 items. The first was a thin ledger of bank documents. "This is a Cayman Islands account," Vinny said quietly, in a voice that filled the courtroom without ever rising. It was opened in March of 2023. It contains $1,400,000 United States dollars. The account holder of record is Stephen Caldwell. The secondary signer is Theresa Morelli. The money was wired in small increments from the trust account of Stephen Caldwell's law firm, beginning 4 months after he began representing Mr. Morelli in this divorce. The judge did not speak. Patricia Cole, across the room, had gone very pale. "Linda Caldwell?" Vinny said. "Stephen's first wife. She came forward 6 weeks ago. She had discovered the account in May. She made copies of every wire transfer. She turned them over to the FBI without being asked to. She wants the court to know that she has nothing to do with the money in it. She wants the money returned to Mr. Morelli's family. With interest, I did not know what to say. I had not seen Linda Caldwell in 11 years. She had divorced Stephen quietly in 2023. Stephen had told me, at the time, that she had become difficult. I had believed him. I had believed him about a lot of things." Vinny set the bank documents on the railing in front of my mother. Then he reached into the accordion folder a second time. What he drew out next, he held in the palm of his hand. It was a small silver evidence pouch. He opened the seal with his thumbnail. He tipped the pouch over the railing, and a small ring fell out of it into his other hand. I knew the ring before I knew that I knew it. My grandfather Antonio had bought that ring in Palermo in 1958. He had saved for it by skipping his lunch for 2 years at the shipyard where he worked. It was a small, simple gold band with a single round diamond, 8/10 of a carat. He had given it to my grandmother on their 30th wedding anniversary. My grandmother had worn it for 31 more years, until the day she died in her sleep. She had left it to my mother, who had left it, by written promise, to Sophia, to be given to her on the day she turned 18. I had not seen that ring in 9 months. I had assumed it was safe in the small upstairs lockbox, where my mother kept her important things. Vinny held it gently. He did not look at Theresa. He did not need to. 2 weeks ago, he said, this ring was sold by Theresa Morelli to the Boston Diamond Exchange on Washington Street for $4,200. The buyer had not yet melted it down. The FBI recovered it 3 days ago. They have asked me to return it to its rightful owner. He turned. He walked toward me. He placed the ring in the center of my palm. The metal was warm. The diamond caught the high courtroom light and held it for a moment like a small, captive sun. I closed my fingers around it. I did not say anything. I could not. I walked the 4 steps to the witness stand. I knelt in front of Sophia for the second time that morning. I opened my palm. The ring sat in the center of it. "Bambina," I said. "This belonged to my grandfather Antonio. He bought it with 2 years of his lunches. He gave it to my grandmother. My mother had been keeping it for you, for your 18th birthday. Your mother sold it. The FBI brought it back. It is yours." She did not take the ring from my hand right away. She looked first at her grandmother, Lucia, in the back, nodded once. Sophia took the ring out of my palm and slipped it onto her own small finger. It was loose. It would fit her later. She would grow into it the way Morelli women grow into the things their grandmothers leave them. Behind us, in the gallery, Maria Russo had risen to her feet. She did not speak. She was walking. Maria Russo's heels made a small, even sound on the polished marble of the courtroom floor. She was 68 years old, only 10 years younger than my mother. But she walked with the same hard, square shoulders that Italian women in our family had learned to carry from their own grandmothers. She walked the way an Italian woman walks when she has made a decision that cannot be unmade. She did not look at the judge. She did not look at me. She did not look at Stephen Caldwell's empty chair, where her daughter's lawyer no longer sat. She did not look at my mother, who was standing very still in the middle of the courtroom with her notebook against her chest. She did not look at Sophia on the witness stand, with the small, loose ring of my grandfather Antonio on her finger. She walked past all of us. She walked straight to the chair where her own daughter Theresa was sitting. Theresa did not stand up. She did not appear to be able to stand up. Her face had become a color I had never seen on a living person. The color of old, wet ash. The hand she had been resting on the table during Lucia's notebook reading was trembling now in the way that a small bird trembles when it has been held in the hand of a child who does not yet understand that birds are easily broken. Maria stopped 2 feet from her daughter. She spoke to the judge first. "Your Honor," Maria said. Her English was as clear as my mother's. The same generation, the same school, the same long, patient practice of being underestimated in their husband's country. "May I please address my daughter for the record?" "Yes, ma'am," Judge Sullivan said, quietly. "Please do." Maria turned the rest of the way around to face Theresa. She did not raise her voice. Italian mothers, in moments of true correction, did not raise their voices either. "Theresa Pasquale Russo," my mother's sister said. The voice was steady. It had been waiting in her throat for many years. "You are the only child I have ever given birth to. I carried you for 9 months. I raised you. I fed you on the same lasagna my own mother fed me. I gave you my mother's name. I gave you my grandmother's name. I gave you the right to call yourself an Italian woman in this country." She drew a quiet breath. She was not going to weep. She was going to do something more permanent than weeping. Today, in front of this court, in front of God, in front of my sister, in front of the granddaughter you have failed, in front of the husband you tried to murder, I am taking it back. Theresa made a small, wet sound at the back of her throat. "You are not my daughter," Maria said. "You are not Russo. You are not Italian. You are not anything that came from the body or the kitchen or the church of my mother. You will not visit me in my old age. You will not bury me. You will not say my name at my funeral. You will not stand at my grave with the family that buried Marco in the rain. The Russo name dies with me, the way it should have died the day you decided to put cash in a bag for a man who would set my best friend's son on fire in the kitchen. His grandfather built." Theresa's mouth opened. Whatever sound came out of it was not a word in any language. It was simply the sound of a daughter learning that she had stopped being one. She placed her hand flat on the wooden table in front of Theresa. The way a mother places her hand on the door of a child's room she will never enter again. "I am done with you," she said. She turned away. She did not turn slowly. She did not turn dramatically. She turned the way an Italian widow turns away from a stain on a kitchen floor she has decided not to clean. She turned and she walked. in the same even heels. The 8 steps from her daughter's chair to my mother's standing position in the middle of the courtroom. Lucia opened her arms. She did not say anything. My mother did not embrace anyone in public. She had not embraced me at my own father's funeral. Maria walked into her sister's arms the way she had walked into them on the docks of New York in 1962, when the two of them, 16 and 20 years old, had stepped off a ship from Palermo with 2 suitcases each and a single English word between them. They embraced in the middle of the courtroom for almost a minute. The whole gallery watched. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. When they finally stepped apart, Maria did one final thing. She reached up to her own neck. She unfastened a small silver chain, the kind of chain that Italian women have worn under their dresses for centuries, and she lifted from beneath her blouse a small medal of Saint Anthony of Padua, the patron saint of lost things. She placed the medal in my mother's hand. "For Sophia," she said, "from the Russo women who will not turn their backs on her. Tell her this is hers now." My mother nodded. She closed her fingers around the medal. Maria Russo walked back to the gallery. She did not look at Theresa. She did not look at the seat she had just vacated. She sat down beside the empty space where her daughter had once been seated as her child. Theresa lowered her face into her hands. She wept the way people weep when they understand that they have been turned out of a house that they cannot find their way back to. I looked at Sophia. She was holding Antonio's ring against her chest with both hands, the way one holds a small bird that one has finally been allowed to keep. Behind her, on the gallery side, Lucia walked toward the witness stand, carrying the medal of St. Anthony with her in the closed cup of her hand. Judge Eleanor Sullivan adjusted the papers in front of her. She tapped her gavel once, very softly, as if she did not want to disturb the small holy thing that had just happened in her courtroom. "We will reconvene," the judge said, "for sentencing. I have heard enough." The court reconvened at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. After the longest lunch recess of my entire life, I had not eaten. I had stood with my mother and my daughter and Maria Russo in a small private room on the 2nd floor of the courthouse, where a federal victims advocate had brought us paper cups of hot tea. Sophia had sat in the lap of her grandmother, with her face pressed into the wool of Lucia's old morning sweater, holding the small loose ring of Antonio Morelli on her finger and the silver medal of St. Anthony in her closed left palm. She had not said a single word the entire 90 minutes. When the bailiff called us back, Lucia took her thumb, dipped it into a small porcelain bowl of olive oil she carried in her purse the way other Italian women carry tissues, and pressed it gently to Sophia's forehead, the kind of blessing my grandmother had given me before my first day of school, the kind that says, "I am sending you back out, but you are no longer going out alone." Patricia Cole was no longer at the prosecutor's table. She had withdrawn from the case at 12:45, in writing, citing irreconcilable ethical concerns. The associate she had left behind looked, even from across the room, like a man who had been asked to push a boulder up a hill with his face. He did not speak. He did not need to. The case had passed out of his hands and into the hands of the United States government. Judge Eleanor Sullivan returned to the bench. She did not adjust her glasses. She did not look at her papers. She had decided what she was going to say at lunch, and she did not need to read it from anywhere. This court has heard evidence this morning of a coordinated, premeditated, multi-year conspiracy by Theresa Pasquale Morelli and Stephen Marcus Caldwell to commit insurance fraud, document forgery, and arson with the intent to take the life of Frank Anthony Morelli. This court is referring the case in its entirety to federal jurisdiction The civil divorce proceeding is dismissed without prejudice to any future claim Mr. Morelli may wish to bring. She paused. She looked at Theresa, who had been brought back into the courtroom with her wrists in metal restraints between two federal marshals. Mrs. Morelli, the judge said quietly, you will not be returning to the home in Quincy. You will not be returning to the daughter you have failed. Your bond is denied. You will be transported, at the close of this hearing, to a federal facility in Connecticut, where you will await trial. Theresa did not look up. The judge turned the page in front of her. The full charges Mr. Caldwell will face are conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit arson, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and the abuse of a fiduciary relationship in his capacity as Mr. Morelli's legal counsel. He will face a federal sentence of no fewer than 22 years. She looked at me when she said it. She nodded once. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. The room exhaled. My mother stood up first. She walked the 8 steps to the witness stand, where Sophia was still sitting with her small hands folded in her lap. Lucia leaned across the wooden railing. She took the silver chain of the St. Anthony medal in her own hand, and she fastened it gently around the small neck of my daughter. St. Anthony is the patron saint of lost things, my mother said. He is also the patron saint of those who have not yet been found. You wear this now, Bambina. You wear it the way our grandmothers wore it. He has been watching you. He will not stop. Sophia touched the medal at her chest. Her eyes were not wet. Her eyes were calm. I walked the 4 steps to the witness stand. I lifted my daughter down into my arms. She was 9 years old. She was small enough still to be carried out of a courthouse by her father. She put her arms around my neck and pressed her face against my collarbone. And for the first time since I had walked into courtroom 408 that morning at 9 o'clock, she let out a long, soft breath of a child who had finally been allowed to rest. We walked, all of us together, out of the room. My mother walked beside me, with her wooden cane and her old black scarf. Maria Russo walked on the other side of her, in her even heels. Vinnie Russo walked behind us, carrying my mother's notebook in both hands, the way one carries a small holy book on the way out of church. Special Agent Maria Delgado walked behind him. When we reached the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 408, I paused. I looked back. Once. At the empty chair where my best friend of 35 years had sat. I looked at the empty chair where my wife of 22 years had sat. I looked at the wooden bench where my mother had been sitting silently since 8 o'clock that morning. I looked at the witness stand where my 9-year-old daughter had stood up and changed the entire shape of my remaining life. Then I turned forward, and I pushed open the doors. The October sunlight on Pemberton Square was the color of a yellow lemon. It came down between the buildings in long, hard angles. It smelled like cold leaves and roasted chestnuts from a cart at the curb. Boston was preparing for winter. The air on my face felt like the first time I had stepped outside in years. Sophia lifted her head from my collarbone. "Are we going home?" "Daddy?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "We are going home. Andiamo a casa," my mother said softly beside me. "We are going home. All of us." I carried my daughter down the courthouse steps in the late autumn sunlight, with my mother on one side of me and my mother's sister on the other. And I understood, for the first time since the morning of my brother Marco's funeral, what it felt like to be surrounded by the family I had always belonged to. 11 months later, on the first Friday in October, I stood at the prep counter of Morelli's Trattoria on Hanover Street and watched the late afternoon sun come through the small kitchen window in the same slow, honey-colored way it had been coming through that window since my grandfather Antonio had cut the glass in 1961. I had changed in those 11 months. Or maybe I had stopped changing. It is sometimes hard to tell the two apart. My back still hurt in the mornings. My hands still smelled like garlic by the end of every shift. My right thumb, which I had only recently been able to bend without thinking about it, had healed in a way that the doctor had said would happen with time and patience. He had been right about both. I had given my body more of each in the last year than I had given it in the previous 40 years combined. The kitchen was quiet at that hour. The dinner service would not begin until 5 o'clock. I had the prep tables and the long stainless steel work counter to myself. I had been arriving at the restaurant a little later than I used to, since the courtroom, because I had decided that the morning belonged to my mother and my daughter and to the long, slow drive between Quincy and Salem Street that allowed all three of us to talk about nothing. Morelli's was approaching her 65th anniversary that autumn. We had been planning the celebration for months. We had decided, after a long conversation with my mother at her kitchen table, that we would close the restaurant for the entire weekend, fill it with the kind of food the restaurant had been built to serve, and invite back every person who had ever crossed our threshold and meant it. The first chair we had set aside, at the head of the long table, would belong to my brother Marco. The second chair would belong to my father. The third chair, the smallest of them, would belong to Sophia. My daughter Sophia was 10 years old now. She had grown 3 inches in the year since the courtroom. She wore her hair in 2 braids now. The way Lucia had worn her hair as a girl in Palermo, she wore, on the days she came to the restaurant after school, a small navy apron with a single word stitched in white thread across the chest. Bambina. The same apron I had sewn for her when she was 4 years old. The same apron she had carried in her left hand on the witness stand. It was now too short on her waist. We had decided not to lengthen it. She would keep it as long as it fit. After that, we would frame it and hang it on the wall of the kitchen, beside the photograph of my grandfather Antonio in 1963. Sophia was at school until 3. After school, on most days, she walked the 3 blocks from her bus stop on Cross Street to the back kitchen door of Morelli's. She let herself in with her own key. She set down her school bag. She washed her hands the way I had taught her. She put on the small apron. She came to stand beside me at the prep counter. She watched my hands. She did what my grandfather had let me do at her age. She peeled garlic. She did not need to be told. My mother Lucia was at the restaurant most evenings now. She did not work. She had not worked in a kitchen since her 65th year. But she came to sit at the small 2-top in the front window with a glass of red wine and her old leather notebook open in front of her, where she would write small entries about the people who came through the door. The notebook was no longer a secret. She had begun to leave it open on the table. Anyone who walked past the window could see her writing in it. Nobody knew what she was writing. Nobody asked. Maria Russo joined her there twice a week. The 2 sisters had become almost inseparable in the year since the courtroom. They spoke in the half-Italian, half-English of women who had lived in 2 countries for too long to belong fully to either. Vinnie Russo, the patient investigator who had walked into our courtroom on that Tuesday morning, had become a regular Friday customer. He sat at the counter. He ate the special. He paid in cash. He never spoke about the work he had done. It was at 4:30 in the afternoon, that Friday in October, that the back kitchen door opened, and Anna Ricci stepped into my kitchen, carrying a large enameled pot of chicken soup against her hip. Anna was a widow. She had lived across the street from my mother on Salem Street for the last 30 years. Her husband had been a marble cutter who had built half the gravestones in Holy Cross Cemetery, including my brother Marco's. Anna had been bringing my mother food every Wednesday for as long as I could remember. In the 11 months since the courtroom, she had begun bringing food to me too. She set the soup pot down on the prep counter. She did not ask me how I was. She did not need to, Frank, she said. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had lived in the North End her whole life. I made too much. Take it home for Sophia. Heat it for her tomorrow morning before school. The mushrooms have been good this week. The bone broth is from the chicken your mother bought from Tony at the corner. Thank you, Anna, I said. She lifted her eyes to mine. She held them for a moment longer than she usually did. Are you ready for tonight? She asked. I looked at her. I looked at the soup pot. I looked at the small, framed photograph of my grandfather on the kitchen wall. The photograph in which Antonio was 28 years old and standing in this same kitchen with a wooden spoon in his hand. Yes. Anna, I said. I am ready for tonight. We have been ready for a long time. By 8 o'clock that evening, the small dining room of Morelli's Trattoria was full of people I had not been able to look at for a long time, without feeling that I had failed them. There were the old neighbors from Hanover Street. There were the suppliers who had been bringing me fish and tomatoes and flour for 30 years. There was Father Vincent from St. Leonard's Church, who had baptized my Sophia and buried my brother and married me, and who looked, that evening, like a man who had been quietly carrying knowledge about my house for 2 decades and was finally being allowed to set it down. There was Vinnie Russo, in his charcoal suit, sitting at the corner table beside Special Agent Maria Delgado of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She was wearing a dress that night for the first time I had ever seen her in one. They had become friends in the year since the case. Vinnie had told me, the previous Wednesday, that he would not be sitting at the counter that evening. He had said, with a small smile, that he had a date. I had not asked him with whom. I had not needed to. There was Linda Caldwell at the table by the window. I had not been able to sit down with her until that night. She had called me 3 times in the first month after the courtroom. She had offered to meet. I had not been ready. She had been patient. She had also, in that year, been very busy. She had taken the $1,400,000 from the Cayman account, after the federal government had returned it to her with interest, and she had donated all of it to a small organization in Boston that helped Italian-American immigrant women set up small businesses of their own. The first 10 women had opened their bakeries and tailoring shops in the spring. My mother had attended every opening. My mother had cried at 4 of them. Stephen Caldwell had been convicted in federal court in May. He had been sentenced to 22 years at Allenwood. He would be 67 years old when he came out. He had not contacted me. I had not expected him to. Theresa had taken a plea deal in June. She had pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit arson, and insurance fraud. She had received a sentence of 12 years. She was being held at a federal facility for women in Connecticut. She had attempted, twice, to write to Sophia, Linda Caldwell, who had volunteered to manage the small mail account on Sophia's behalf, had returned both letters unopened. But the third thing about Linda Caldwell, the thing that had made her cry the first time we spoke on the phone after the courtroom, was Lucas. Lucas was 4 years old. He was a small, dark-haired boy with the long lashes of his mother and the high forehead of the man who had pretended to be my brother for 35 years. He had been born in the early months of 2021 in a hospital in Newport, Rhode Island. where Theresa had been having her so-called girls' nights for years. He had been delivered into the world by the only woman who had been willing to claim him. Linda Caldwell had taken Lucas home that morning, the way Italian women have always taken in children, whose own parents had decided, for one reason or another, that they were not going to be parents. She had raised him in the small blue house she had bought after her divorce. She had given him her own last name. That evening, Lucas sat in a high chair at Linda's table with a small plate of plain noodles in front of him, and he ate with the careful, half-amazed attention of a 4-year-old who had not yet learned that any of this was complicated. I looked at him once, across the room. I did not look at him again. He had nothing to do with any of it. He had nothing to apologize for. He was a small boy eating noodles, and someday I would teach him how to peel garlic, the way my grandfather had taught me, the way I had taught Sophia. Anna Ricci had stayed in the kitchen with me through the entire service. She was wearing the same simple black dress she had worn to every wedding and every wake in the North End for the last 40 years, with her gray hair pulled back in a small, neat knot. She had not asked to be paid. She had not asked to be thanked. She moved through my kitchen the way a woman moves through a kitchen she has known her whole life, even though she had only been working in it for 11 months. At 9:30, between the antipasti and the second course, we were standing alone beside the prep counter. The dining room was loud with voices and music and the small, unmistakable sound of an Italian family eating together for the first time in too long. Anna touched my forearm with the back of her hand. "It is a good gathering, Frank," she said quietly. "It is a beginning," I said. She did not move her hand away. "Then I want you to know something," she said. "I am not going to ask you anything. I am not going to push at anything. But when you are ready, in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years, I will still be here. I have been bringing food to your mother for 30 years. I am very good at being patient." She lifted her hand from my forearm. She walked back into the dining room. I did not say anything to her. In that moment, I did not need to. I reached, instead, for the small bottle of grappa my grandfather had brought from Sicily in 1959. The bottle we had kept on the shelf above the stove for 65 years. The bottle that had only ever been opened on the most important nights of our family's life. I uncorked it. I poured 3 small glasses. Then I walked out of the kitchen, toward the head of the long table, where my mother and my daughter were waiting for me. I set the 3 glasses down on the white linen of the long table at the head of the room. My mother stood up. My daughter stood up. We did not speak. We did not need to. We had been preparing to stand together for the better part of a year. The room saw us. The room did not stop talking right away. The room slowed gradually, the way water slows on the way to a deep pool. A man's voice at the far end of the room finished a sentence. A glass clinked at the bar. A child laughed once, somewhere near the window. And then the room was still. I picked up the small spoon from my plate. I tapped it gently against the side of the grappa glass in front of me. The sound carried through Morelli's the way it had been carrying for 65 years. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," I said. "I want to thank you for being patient with me during a year that I am not yet able to talk about cleanly. I want to thank you for filling these chairs around my mother's table." I looked once down the long table. The first chair, at the head, on my left, was empty. The plate had been set. The napkin had been folded. We had filled the glass at that place with red wine and left it untouched, because the man whose name had been carved into the basement beam of this restaurant had been dead for 7 years now, and we wanted him here anyway. The second empty chair was for my father. The third was for a small 4-year-old girl who had not yet learned to walk to her own seat without holding her father's finger. I lifted my grappa glass. My mother lifted hers. My daughter lifted hers. My family has lived in this room since 1961. I said, my grandfather opened this door with $7 and a recipe. My father stood at that stove until the morning he fell against it. My brother carried the books in the basement until the cancer told him not to. I have peeled garlic at this counter for 45 years. I paused. I looked at Salvatore, my old cook, at the far end of the long table. Salvatore had come to work at Morelli's in 1965, the year my father took over the books. He had taught me half of what I knew. He was crying without trying to hide it. I did not look away. I spent a long time in my life, I said, believing that family was the people who looked like me, the people who shared my blood, the people whose names were on my marriage certificate or my mortgage papers. A whole year ago this month, I learned that this was the wrong way to count. Family, I said, is not blood. Family is not paper. Family is the people who show up. I lifted the glass a little higher, to my mother Lucia, who waited 22 years to speak, to my daughter Sophia, who carried our family when she was 9 years old, to my Aunt Maria, who walked away from her own daughter so that mine could keep her name, to Linda, who took in a child the world wanted nothing to do with, to Father Vincent, to Vinnie Russo, to Salvatore, who fed every Morelli child for 60 years, to Anna, who has been waiting a very long time, to everyone in this room, to my brother Marco, to my father, to my grandfather Antonio, who is not here tonight, but who is also very much here. I drew a breath. The breath was warm. It tasted of garlic and grappa and the small, sweet smoke of a kitchen that had been feeding people for 65 years. Salute, I said. Salute, the room answered. 300 glasses lifted into the small yellow lamplight at the same moment. The sound was like a small, soft rain. We drank. The dinner went on for another 4 hours. People sang. People danced. My mother fell asleep with her head on Maria's shoulder around midnight. Anna helped me wrap leftovers for the families taking food home. By 1 o'clock in the morning, Morelli's was quiet again. I drove to Holy Cross Cemetery alone, with a glass jar of red wine on the passenger seat. The October moon was high. The headstones were the color of old milk. I knelt at my grandfather Antonio's grave first. I poured a small splash of wine onto the cold ground. 65 years. Nonno, I said. We made it. She is going to be all right. I knelt at my father's grave next. I poured another splash. Papa, I said. I am sorry it took me so long. I think you knew. I knelt at my brother Marco's grave last. I poured the rest of the wine. The earth absorbed it slowly, the way the earth absorbs anything offered to a man whose absence has been waiting that long to be honored. Marco, I said, we are going to be fine. Sophia is fine. Mama is fine. The restaurant will keep going. You can rest. I set down 3 small votive candles I had brought in my coat pocket from St. Leonard's. I lit them one by one. The flames did not waver in the October wind. They held. I drove home to Quincy. The kitchen was warm. The light over the stove had been left on for me. I sat down at the small wooden table and opened the black-bound journal I had purchased at the Brattle bookshop on West Street. It was volume 18. I opened to a clean page. I wrote, slowly, at the top of it, letter number 10, to Sophia. on the occasion of her 10th birthday. Outside the window, the late October stars were the color of old gold. Somewhere across the Charles River, in a cemetery in Malden, 3 votive candles were still burning quietly above 3 Morelli men, and inside my own quiet kitchen, 3 lights were also glowing, the lamp above my hand, the small light under the door of my daughter's room, and the soft yellow light from the spare room down the hall, where my mother had decided, 3 months ago, to begin sleeping over on Friday nights. I bent my head. I began to write.